Souvlaki is an addictive Greek dish that features juicy grilled meat, tzatziki, and vegetables all wrapped up in a pita bread. This recipe has been adapted for apartment living, so no assumption that you have a barbecue or grill at your disposal, but it still delivers lots of fresh flavor for a fast and easy weeknight meal. Souvlaki traditionally refers to things that are grilled on skewers. However, nowadays if you order souvlaki, you usually just get some kind of grilled meat served alongside pita bread, tzatziki, french fries, vegetables, salad, you name it. We are going to be making this version of souvlaki in a skillet. However, if you have a grill at home, feel free to put the meat on skewers and grill it instead after we've tossed it with the dressing. This recipe is made up of 4 major components. First, there's the meat, which we will be brining instead of marinating. Second, the tzatziki, which is that classic Greek yogurt sauce. Third, the dressing, which we'll be using in 2 different ways throughout the recipe. And fourth, the vegetables, which will be a mix of sweet onions and peppers. We are using pork today, but chicken would also be a great substitute if you would prefer to use that. I've chosen to use boneless pork chops, which I've already cut into bite-sized pieces. However, I've also had great success using pork tenderloin in this recipe. Ultimately, the cut of meat that you use doesn't matter so much as long as it is something that you can cook quickly so that it stays juicy and tender. We're going to help that tenderness along by first brining the meat before we mix it with our dressing. I rarely use marinades for meat. You can find thousands upon thousands of recipes telling you to use all different kinds of marinades to flavor and tenderize your meat, but the problem is marinades are not very good at doing either. Meat has a dense protein structure, which means that the tenderizing and flavoring enzymes in that marinade have a really hard time penetrating past the surface level of that meat. The other problem is that marinades are often made up of fat-soluble ingredients. That means that those flavor compounds will dissolve easily into fat or oil, but not into water. But meat is made up of primarily water, not fat, which means that those flavorful ingredients aren't actually going to permeate into the water that makes up the meat. The one exception for that are onions and garlic. Those are water-soluble ingredients, so those flavors will permeate through, as well as salt or sugar, which are water-soluble minerals. But anything else that you use, no difference. And to top it all off, marinating requires planning way in advance, all for something that's not really gonna make much of a difference. You can marinate something for a week, it's not gonna be any more effective. So, skip marinating and go for brining instead. Now you may be thinking, all right, Chelsea, well, if marinating doesn't work, what's the deal with brining? I will tell you. A brine is a salt water solution, sometimes flavored with other water-soluble ingredients like sugar, onions, and garlic. Since there's such a high concentration of salt in the water, it does a relatively quick job of permeating through the meat, seasoning it, and denaturing the proteins, which will ultimately make that meat more tender. So instead of marinating our pork a full day in advance, we're simply going to toss it into a brine while we prepare the rest of our ingredients. And by the time we're ready to cook the meat and the vegetables, the brine will have already done its work. The base of tzatziki is yogurt. I always go for full-fat Greek yogurt. It has a better texture, mouthfeel, and flavor than the low-fat stuff. Then we will be adding lemon, garlic, salt, pepper, mint, cucumber, and crumbled feta cheese, so that it has a really clean, assertive tang that highlights all of the other flavors in this dish. In my opinion, it's really the tzatziki that makes this recipe so successful. Texture is really important when it comes to tzatziki. You want it to be thick enough that it's going to cling to the meat and not just drip right off. You also want to make sure that it has bold enough flavors that you feel like you're eating tzatziki and not just yogurt with stuff in it. Mix it together and set it aside. The longer those flavors have to marry, the better it will be. Our dressing is a pretty simple and balanced mixture to bring those fresh Mediterranean flavors to our meat and vegetables. We'll be using olive oil as our base, adding in lemon and apple cider vinegar for acidity, honey to help temper the sharpness of the acid, then dried herbs, garlic, salt, and pepper. The key to this dressing is that it is going to be used at 2 different points throughout the recipe. We will split it in half and use half of it by tossing it with the meat before cooking, and the other half by tossing it with the vegetables after cooking. This makes a difference because heat alters and affects flavor compounds. In the case of this dressing, having some of it with heat applied and some of it cold means we will end up with a more multi-layered flavor experience than if we were using it all in the same way. Our pork is going to be accompanied by a simple mix of sweet onions and peppers. We're going to break down the onions and peppers into strips, then toss them with a bit of oil and salt before cooking. Since we will be tossing the vegetable with an oil-based dressing after cooking, we want to make sure we don't end up with greasy vegetables. To ensure that, we're going to toss the onions and the peppers with a bit of vegetable oil before cooking, rather than adding that oil directly into the pan. That way, as we lift the onions and peppers out of the bowl and transfer it to our hot skillet, the excess oil will be left behind. Every meal that you make has some kind of process logic to it. Since this recipe has several different components, which will be all eaten at the same time, we want to be strategic about the order in which we do things. For example, we prepped all of our ingredients first, as well as made the cold elements of this meal, prioritizing those things according to those which would benefit the most or be harmed by time. Brining the meat automatically went first, so that it would be done by the time we finished our other work. Then we made the tzatziki, because letting it sit once it's made only improves the flavor. Then the dressing, followed by cutting the vegetables. But really, you could have reversed the order of those two if you wanted. What matters is that those things are done by the time we start cooking, so that once the cooking is finished, we are ready to eat right away. As to the cooking order, I would typically do the meat and the vegetables in 2 different skillets side by side. But since I'm working with just a single burner today, I'm going to do the meat first, which will allow it to have time to rest and the juices to redistribute while I cook the vegetables, which I know will cook relatively quickly. Now onto the vegetables. Cooking them on high heat is going to break down the bitter flavor compounds in the peppers and onions and coax out their natural sweetness while still leaving them with a bit of bite. When I'm developing recipes, there are 4 criteria I'm mentally rating the dish on. How easy is it to find the ingredients? How expensive is it going to be? How simple is it going to be to make it? And is it something I can scale up and use to feed a crowd of people? So here's how I would rate this dish. These are pretty stock standard ingredients, none of which are too affected by seasonality. If you want, you can easily swap chicken for the pork. Since this recipe doesn't feature any exotic or finicky ingredients, it's pretty inexpensive to make, and you likely already have many of the ingredients on hand. Considering that it's a full meal that doesn't rely on a carbohydrate like pasta, potatoes, or rice to give it substance, it's on the cheaper end. This recipe doesn't require that you do anything complicated. It just has multiple steps. If you follow a strategic order for those steps, though, you knock this whole thing out from start to finish in well under an hour. Faster if you have people you can delegate to. Yes, this meal is fantastic for crowds. It makes a great main for a barbecue party, or you can transfer everything to a sheet pan and cook the meat and vegetables together in the oven. Add in a green salad and some rice or a basket of flatbread and you are set. Check out the recipe in the video description below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay posted on more recipes and videos. I'll see you next time.